All right, I think we are at time, and for the rest of the participants who will be joining us, they'll just join us as we go. So once again, good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us on this chilly Monday morning. My name once again is Florence Ogonjo from CIPIT and the AI policy team. And as mentioned when we were beginning today, we will be doing a brief overview of the draft Kenya AI policy on emerging tech and AI policy. So basically, when this draft was published, I think 2 weeks ago, I'm going to give it a week because it's been a week or so, but it's also given 2 weeks. When this draft came out, there's been quite a number of conversations that have already been ongoing with respect to the policy, what it means for the Kenyan AI ecosystem, especially in terms of how we are looking at regulation. Of course, this comes under the backdrop of us having the Kenya AI strategy, which was also published in 2025. And just recently a standing committee was appointed at Cabinet to be able to oversee the implementation of the strategy, which also comes at the backdrop of us having had a sort of AI bill being proposed at Senate. So we are seeing quite a number of activities with respect to regulation happening within the AI ecosystem. And the policy also brings in a different development, so to speak, with respect to how we are looking at regulation. So looking at it from those sort of three perspectives on what anchors it within the ecosystem, what we have as foundational laws, this policy brings us a perspective and different key elements, which we will ideally look at during this discussion. So the general outlook for this particular webinar session will be, we'll have a brief overview of what the policy looks at. It's quite a substantive and quite a big policy. So we're hoping to be able to break it down and break certain parts for you so that you don't necessarily need to read the entire policy, but can reflect on specific key highlights and key provisions from the policy and what it proposes. And then we'll have a sort of panel discussion and looking at it slightly in a more introspective perspective. So here at CIPIT, we look at research within technology from three key parameters being AI, data governance, and intellectual property. So we'll give it a perspective and an outlook that also sees how the policy touches on those specific key elements. And then we'll also add another layer on top of it in terms of looking at it from research and innovation, in terms of looking at it from a tech perspective. So to enable us to do that, we will have Dr. Betsy Mirethi, who's here. We'll have Joshua Kitili. We'll also have Jabet Koros, who will be able to help us have conversations within those other thematic areas and how the policy speaks onto those parts. Just to mention once again, if you have any questions, comments, clarifications in the course of this particular session, please feel free to put those within the chat section. And as we go on and as you continue to join, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're listening to us from. So I'll kick it off with a brief overview of the policy. So I'll share my screen and so we can have an overview of just generally the policy and what it provides. Right, so we'll have a brief overview of the policy, and basically what the policy is that it's generally a comprehensive framework just based on the numberings, based on what the content that it has and how big it actually is as a policy. It has quite a few things in it. It's of course very much clear that it's anchored on the Constitution and also anchored on Vision 2030 towards looking at how we're looking at innovation, leveraging of technology and such. So it continues to state its ambition. We derive its ambition from what the Kenya AI strategy had originally presented to us, being that it presents itself as being an anchor towards ensuring that Kenya is positioned regionally as a leader within specific parameters, being AI research and innovation, as well as AI development. So it states our ambition in terms of these key parameters in not only using technology as consumers, but ultimately as being producers, deployers, and creating an environment that enables the regulation to enhance investment, as well as a sitting of Kenya or a positioning of Kenya within the wider global AI ecosystem. So what this policy predominantly provides. It provides 9 key thematic policy pillars, has identified 17 problems which the policy is addressing in its policy statements, and is structured in 5 key chapters, plus a number of annexes with respective documents that go into it. So let's have a look at what's actually inside this particular document and what's within the respective chapters, the respective 5 chapters. So the introduction, of course, is anchors what the policy is about. It gives a background on AI and emerging technologies in Kenya, also gives a background on the foundational sort of elements and laws that anchor AI regulation within the ecosystem, aside from the constitution. And then it identifies the policy issues, policy areas, and specific rationales for those particular policy issues it's identifying. It sets out specific policy goals and policy objectives, which are 10. Like I said, the policy has quite a number of, it's quite robust, is what I'd say. It has quite a number of parameters within it. Looking at different elements and aspects across either technology, different things that touch on different stakeholders, different sectors, and the interplay within even the environment in and of itself. It also provides specific guiding principles that also anchor the particular policy. We'll also have a look at those as well. Chapter 2 gives you your situational analysis, just a general overview and scoping of what Global South looks like, what the regional AI ecosystem looks like, and then what the national context on AI looks like, and what the role of governments is in terms of enhancing AI regulation from that perspective. And then, of course, the positioning of Kenya within that wider ecosystem. It looks at specific review of legal, regulatory, institutional frameworks, which we tend to term as foundational legal instruments that anchor the regulation of AI right now, because AI in and of itself doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists concurrently within different disciplines, which we would say already have certain specific regulatory elements that would generally apply to how we are looking at AI regulation. Then it has the most substantive and the most robust part, which is chapter 3, which is the meat of the policy, which gives you your policy statements. So the policy statements in and of themselves are anchored across different thematic areas, but in total, you'll find that there are about 173 policy statements, signifying what the government will do within those 9 thematic specific pillars. So it ensures that it also sort of brings out specific objectives and lists those particular statements. Going on to the 4th and the 5th chapters basically gives you what a policy ideally would also give you in terms of an implementation framework, the specific agencies, ministries that would be in charge of the particular implementation parameters, as well as suggestions for legal reforms for specific policies that should also be identified. It also introduces in and of itself specific bodies that would be in charge of these particular processes, and then gives you your monitoring and evaluation, reporting and learning elements as the last chapter, giving you baseline indicators of how this particular policy will be implemented, the practicality of it, and just an overview of whether, from your own perspectives, you can see whether it fits theoretically speaking, and whether it's actually practical based on what the content of the policy gives us. Then the annex areas, of course, giving you your implementation matrix, how they looked at stakeholder engagements, and a definition, list of definitions, list of references, and things like that. So those are just generally standard. Now, going into the actual meat of the policy and its goals and objectives, what does this policy actually set out to achieve in terms of building the AI governance structures in the AI ecosystem in Kenya? Primary to its goals is establishment of a coherent rights-based, innovation-enabled, future-oriented national framework for governance, development, deployment, and use of AI. So we are looking at it not just from, I would say, the non-technical bit of it, which is the governance perspective of it, but also from the slightly more technical elements of it. And when I say technical here, I mean with respect to how we are looking at AI technologies and emerging technologies. So our capacity to be able to develop AI technologies within the country, our capacity to also be able to deploy some of the AI tools that are already in use within the country. So also it anchors it in terms of it being strengthened, being a strengthening element to public service, but in as much as we are leveraging artificial intelligence, ensuring that there's safeguards in terms of rights safety, in terms of how leveraging artificial intelligence would impact the economy, the economic growth overall, and how it would generally promote a sustainable ecosystem for national resilience and competitiveness. So the competitive edge as well comes up with respect to what the primary goal is. So like I said, it lists 10 key policy objectives. You look at it in terms of the first one being research, investment, creating centers for excellence, supporting MSMEs as well, looking at it from an element of commercialization as well as IP frameworks. Then looking at it from the fact that the objective is to promote responsible, inclusive, safe, and scalable application of AI across the different sectors that have also been identified within the policy, building capacity and human capital across specifically the education sector throughout the entire education lifecycle, within both public and private sectors, and ensuring that capacity building for the general public has also been done to enable clear adoption and use of these particular technologies. Then looks at it from a perspective of sort of the environmental component of it, in terms of establishing national green intelligence frameworks that would be able to govern the environmental footprint of AI, and in terms of looking at it from its compute infrastructure. Then we have it in terms of establishing clear, coordinated, risk-based governance framework. So you see from the policy objectives, it specifically identifies the governance approach as being sort of a risk-based framework with defined institutional roles, which have legal certainty. So the document actually does establish quite a number of other bodies within it that would be able to sort of govern it within this perspective, which we'll also look at as we go through the presentation. Other policy elements and objectives of it include also building trust to different systems, especially the national data ecosystem, and building those particular standards in terms of sharing and ethical annotation. Ensuring again looking at it within the respect of ethical AI, looking at it in terms of ensuring there's safe, secure, inclusive, explainable, auditable, and accountable AI, and there's elements of redress for harm for those who are harmed, or there's a channel that's been created for receiving redress. Then we look at it in terms of also establishing affordable, secure, and a governed compute infrastructure that also enables shared access and sovereign cloud and connectivity. So data sovereignty is a key element that comes in here with respect to looking at the policy objectives. And then leading on to, again, looking at sovereignty, guaranteeing data sovereignty and an element of AI sovereignty, as well as strategic autonomy over how we are looking at data, compute, our knowledge assets within the country. And then lastly is establishing Kenya as a regional leader in terms of looking at AI within its specific capabilities, but also in consideration of the risks that come with it. So that's just a basic highlight of what the policy objectives give you. Some of them are correlated and borrow from each other, but that's the setting of the policy objectives. So its scope is generally with respect to, the policy will apply to technology, to AI and emerging technology specifically. So what it provides for in here is with respect to IoT blockchain. It gives a parameter where it describes or defines what emerging technologies are. Within the policy itself, it further describes or rather defines what AI is. However, the definition hasn't necessarily been indicated within scope, which is something that ideally should have been done because it only describes what emerging tech is. It cuts across public, private sector, civil society actors, foreign entities whose AI outputs are used or in effect within Kenya. So it gives a more effects-based content within who it covers. It looks at very specific sectors, so it covers all sectors, either formal, informal, between health, agriculture, finance, education, security, environmental, digital services, and any other sectors that would ideally come up with respect to the use of artificial intelligence. It also covers the full breadth and life cycle of artificial intelligence, from research all the way up until it's deployed, used, and looking at environmental parameters as well, and specific redress mechanisms that may be needed, and environmental management elements that will come up with the use of AI. It also mentions within its scope an element of devolution in that it sets out national standards that actually set a baseline for how county governments and other implementing bodies would ideally need to align with this particular framework. So it gives a certain period within which the policy or regulations would come into effect, or people would be required to comply. It gives pretty much 2 years, a period of 2 years for compliance with specific elements, and it excludes non-machine learning tools and AI tools that are used for personal use, and identifies those as the limitations of the particular scope. Also to mention that within the policy also, it's anchored under the Constitution, and it also mentions that within its scope, it doesn't override what already exists in the foundational laws identified within the policy, being, for example, the Data Protection Act, Computer Misuse and Cyber Crimes Act, and such other parameters, such other legislative frameworks that already exist, that are considered foundational frameworks that would apply to the regulation of AI. So a brief overview of what the guiding principles actually give. Some of them you might already be familiar with because they have already been encased in different instruments, either identified in the AI strategy itself or identified through some international instruments that look at the regulation of AI or AI governance generally. So the guiding principles are that it should be anchored in a human rights-based approach. Human-centeredness and meaningful human control is central to this. Protection of human agency, risk-based approach towards regulation, looks at safety, security, and robustness as well as being one of the guiding principles. Transparency, accountability, and the right to know, which also gives sort of an intersection with how you would look at data protection laws and some of the principles anchored under it. Looks at inclusion and equity as well, and looks at elements of sustainability. Those are just the first anchoring 8. And within the first anchoring 8, you'll notice that the human-centered approach, or rather the human nature of it, is really emphasized within the first 8. And then the second set of 8 look at sort of innovation and how these principles would ideally interact within different sectors and its particular use. So the 9th looks at innovation enablement, looking at a competitive ecosystem, public value and state capability, the ability of the country and of the state to be able to develop, leverage, and use artificial intelligence, what benefits it has to the public, bringing in elements of public service in there, then public participation and democratic governance, involvement of the people again, in terms of how we are looking at AI regulation and AI governance, elements of sovereignty and strategic autonomy come in here, in terms of maintaining data sovereignty and AI sovereignty in and of itself. Then looking at a local first approach towards how we are looking at artificial intelligence through local value creation, then ensuring that communities are also represented and bringing out certain key principles and key elements that are slightly more localized to the Kenyan context in terms of community and mutual responsibility, the elements of Harambee I mentioned in there. Then interoperability and openness of the standards, slightly more technical elements, and then the element of doing no harm, ensuring that all AI systems and tools that are being leveraged and used, even developed, do not cause further harm. So just as a basic summary of what the guiding principles give us. So onto the problems that the policy intends to actually solve and why we have this policy. So the main identified problems with respect to fragmented governance. So the common notion that we as a country do not have an integrated framework across AI life cycles or a standalone policy that looks at how we are looking at AI governance that can speak to AI regulation specifically. It instead is anchored in different either foundational laws or different policy instruments that exist. Another problem it's intending to solve is the skills and labor transition. So the shortages in AI and data science, plus job displacement risks that happen without structured reskilling. Then we look at it from another problem being that it presents unprotected value chain of workers. So elements of looking at data annotators, content moderators, who often face very harmful content and exposure and weak safeguards that are not necessarily put in place to them. Then another problem it's intended to solve is infrastructure dependence, noting that we are currently heavily reliant on either foreign controlled compute or cloud limits, which limit data sovereignty and data control. Then data gaps and interoperability as well, in terms of limited availability of data, also speaking to the quality of data that's required for creating integrative data sets that would ideally reduce inclusivity and accuracy. Then an element of inequality and exclusion is also identified as a problem that the policy intends to cure, being the uneven access and underrepresentation of women, youth, persons with disabilities, and those in rural populations. It also specifically identifies underinvestment in research and development and the limited legal specificity for automated decisions, noting that that is only specifically currently anchored under the Data Protection Act. Also brings out elements of environmental and energy sustainability and clear liability approaches towards the use of AI, problems identified within public sector use and the risks that come with it, as well as weak assurance capacity. Looks at also the economic context of it in terms of market power concentration, as well as an important need for the protection of language and cultural diversity, as well as the protection for community data, or rather the lack of protections for community data within that particular respect. So that's it with respect to what it intends to solve. So in looking at what it intends to solve, it's specific policy priorities with respect, again, to research, innovation, and commercialization, ensuring that we have created a robust ecosystem for research, innovation, and commercialization. It speaks to sectoral applications of AI. So it's policy statements made with respect to sectoral applications of AI. Then touches on capacity and human capital development, which looks at job skilling, reskilling, the future of work with respect to leveraging AI. Looks at elements of environmental sustainability and leveraging green AI, especially since Kenya is trying to position itself as not just a consumer of AI, but as a developer of AI. So what are the environmental implications that come with that? Then looking at it more holistically from the governance, legal, and regulatory frameworks perspective, which feeds into now what we have as foundational laws and what needs to be changed within those foundational laws so that they can be better anchoring for regulatory parameters, and also an introduction of other parameters as well for the governance of AI within the ecosystem. Then looks at the data ecosystem management as a thematic pillar as well. So looking at data more broadly and holistically, not just within the confines of personal data, but also non-personal data, and how we are looking at that within the Kenyan ecosystem. It brings in elements of ethics, safety, security, and inclusion. So how we are looking at ethical and responsible AI within Kenya, how elements of safety and security come up from the technical perspective as well as from the user perspective of it. Looking at our infrastructure and digital readiness as well. So elements of digital divide, what our infrastructure looks like in terms of either compute power, data infrastructure, data readiness, data quality, and things like that. And then looks at sovereignty and strategic autonomy, which goes back again to data sovereignty, which feed one way or the other into the data ecosystem, as well as what our infrastructure looks like. So those they have interlinks within which sort of looked at from the same perspective. Okay, so the policy statements in and of themselves, what you'll notice with them is they're anchored under the pillar, of course, depending on what thematic area they arrive from, then gives you the policy objective, what it sets out to rather achieve, and then what the government is going to do or undertake, and then the measures, specific measures towards achieving those particular measures. So a very intricate detail in how that ideally is meant to be looked at. But as I mentioned, as I was starting, the policy statements in total are about 137. So raises a few questions on how we will be looking at implementation capabilities of all those particular thematic areas and policy statements as they have been made. So yeah, so the policy statements are basically the operative core of this particular policy for which I've already discussed. So this I won't go through once again. So the policy statements broken down in basically fives and their specific thematic areas. These are basic highlights, but if you do read the policy in and of itself, you'll find that they're slightly more robustly elaborated. So with respect to research and innovation, we see government commitments in terms of promoting research and development, especially for indigenous models, supporting the local first approach through local innovation and commercialization, elements of open access to markets, and strengthening AI safety research and assurance. With respect to sectoral applications, the policy presents an element of strengthening sectoral readiness and lifecycle governance through ensuring mainstream for AI productivity, deployment of localized solutions, and establishment of a national AI missions portfolio, which is generally intended to create a portfolio that has the AI systems and or tools that are being developed and deployed within the country and across the board, so that we can see within which particular sectors they're already being leveraged and they already sort of apply. In terms of capacity and human capital, we are looking at it from the perspective of establishing a national AI fluency framework, integrating the same into AI and education, building that the teacher also elements, building the teacher's capacity within also the particular ecosystem and also the wider public sector to increase fluency and adaptability to AI. Also brings in commitments of the government in terms of protecting workers and driving workforce transformation in that particular element. As I had also mentioned earlier when I was beginning, the policy also establishes quite a number of bodies and other institutions as well. So environmental sustainability, setting up the life cycle for environmental accountability, makes commitments towards protecting sensitive ecosystem, promoting resource-efficient infrastructure, enabling AI for environmental management as well. In terms of government governance and regulation, it makes commitments in terms of establishing a national governance architecture and council to be able to build, and also building a risk-based framework, then a governance of sandboxes as well, also creates parameters for the regulation of procurement for public sector adoption of artificial intelligence. Then with respect to the last few policy statements and policy pillars, with respect to the data ecosystem, we see commitments with respect to mandating data set documentation and provenance standards, establishing lawful data access frameworks, developing high-value data sets, and as well as commitments towards building trusted national data infrastructure. Then with respect to ethics and safety and inclusion, we see commitments towards upholding ethics, transparency, and accountability, ensuring safety and human oversight, secure systems, promoting inclusion through different parameters, as well as creating a governance mechanism for security and defense uses. Infrastructure and digital readiness, we also see commitments towards reporting on compute status, commitments towards classifying specific workloads, commitments towards enhancing connectivity, driving investment, anchoring regional hosting, harnessing renewable energy, and treating compute and the treatment of compute as a strategic key element within the infrastructure in of itself. In terms of sovereignty and strategic autonomy, we see government commitments towards safeguarding sovereignty, strengthening international leadership and AI diplomacy, promotion of fair and open markets, and recognizing Kenya and African language as being strategic within this particular ecosystem, especially as we're looking at sovereignty and strategic autonomy. That's pretty much. I will stop there with respect to the government commitments and what they prescribe, because these also go hand in hand in terms of looking at the flagships and deliverables. I am also seeing that I might be out of time, so I would need to give us a bit more time so that the panelists can have time for clear discussion. But the next part basically just gives you what the flagship commitments are, and it now establishes the numerous institutions and bodies that would be looking at each particular thematic area and what the commitments under those thematic areas would also be. So there's the development of an innovation fund, the AI missions portfolio, fluency framework, environmental disclosures for high impact assessment, running down the thematic areas, governance and regulation as well in terms of development of the National AI Council. Again, it gives also an element of the development of a dedicated AI and Emerging Technologies Governance Act as well. So it brings out those particular key parameters. It also gives, more importantly to mention, within the data ecosystem and management thematic pillar, development of national data set standards. So the development of a national data library, which would be a register for high-value data sets with controlled access. For ethics, safety, and inclusion, it gives the development of the Kenya AI Safety Institute for providing different safeguards within the AI ecosystem, particularly touching on safeguards for children with the use of AI, looking at also the defense framework that we would have, and the use and control of lethal force. So thinking about it in terms of autonomous use of weapons in that particular parameter. Then also establishes the National AI Compute Access Program. I'm looking at it from, again, the green perspective in terms of developing compute zones that are green, and developing of minimum targets for public workloads that would be hosted domestically. Then lastly, we have the data localization for sensitive data sets and things like that. So I will stop there because, like I mentioned, the policy in and of itself is quite robust. So the only other elements that we're remaining with are what we have in terms of its implementation frameworks, what it gives in terms of how it intends to implement the bodies and the structures for implementation, and also, of course, the most important bit, which is the financial element of it, which it also gives specific parameters. So yeah, this is the policy in and of itself, quite robust, introduces very many substantive elements and very many bodies as well. We will now just have a brief discussion on what this actually means for the Kenya AI ecosystem, just based on whatever anchoring policies we already have in terms of our strategy, in terms of how the ecosystem is now flowing, in terms of even the draft national data governance framework that we already had go through public participation, and then now adding another top layer to this as well. So we'll just have conversations on that and how is likely to impact the Kenyan AI ecosystem, especially the governance perspective of it. So yeah, that was quite a lot, to be very honest. And so in discussion, we will be having Chebet Koros, again, Dr. Betsy Mureithi and Joshua Kitili. I will give them an opportunity to first and foremost introduce themselves before we dive into the strict unpacking of this particular policy.
Thank you very much, Florence. I hope I'm audible. Yes, so my name is Chebet Koros. I'm a research fellow at CIPIT, leading the IP and Innovation Department.
Hi everyone. Betsy Mureithi, a research fellow at iLab Africa. iLab Africa is a research center within Strathmore University and at the School of Computing, working on research and innovation around ICT for development.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Joshua Kitili. Yeah, and I'm also a research associate here at CIPIT. We are dealing with IP, AI, and also data governance. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for the introduction. So we'll quickly dive into it and begin looking at it from the slightly more intellectual property perspective of it, noting that it's a key discipline that also interacts with AI in different ways. So we'll start with Chebet and just Chebet, tell us, like, based on how you have seen the outlook or the overview of the policy, how this interacts with the IP ecosystem, and also noting that we've just recently had the IP policy as well come out, and how those sort of two speak to each other and what this actually means for the Kenyan AI ecosystem in terms of looking at governance from a broader perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try and be as brief as possible. So first thing is to, as you mentioned, last week we had the public participation for the draft National Intellectual Property Policy and Strategy. So it's very interesting that a lot of these policies and strategies and also reforms of our intellectual property laws are happening right now. This year alone, there have been the Geographical Indications Bill, the Copyright and Related Rights Bill, the Kenya Intellectual Property Bill, and then the IP policy. and then now we're talking about the AI policy. And so it's very interesting that all these things are happening at the same time. They deal with the same issues in terms of intellectual property and AI-generated outputs or AI-assisted inventions, talking about the data around it and the intellectual property that is owned in the outputs and also in the inputs of this AI. So it's very interesting that all this conversation is happening. But for me, what I'm seeing is a lot of different conversations happening which are not matched together. So in terms of your question and looking at the AI policy, I have about 4 points to talk about where I see IPs being brought in and basically what the policy says for it. So the first one is ownership of AI generated outputs and inventions. So even from the situational analysis of the policy, it mentions the gap. So it will say that there's limited clarity in IP frameworks regarding ownership of AI generated outputs, which is including models, data sets, content, creating uncertainty for the innovators. So that statement, it's creating uncertainty for the innovators. So when I read that, my mind is that this policy should give me that certainty as an innovator, as an inventor. The glossary defines what AI generated output is, which simply says it's content that is produced by an AI system. Goes on to say that the authorship, ownership, and protection of which may require treatment distinct from works created by a natural person. So our current Copyright Act provides for a natural person to be the author and owner of copyrighted works. The Industrial Property Act, which provides for patenting laws, also provides for having a human as an inventor. So outrightly there, we have that kind of question still, because the policy still says that there might be need for extra treatment. Okay, let's move on to policy statement 3.13, which provides that the government commits to strengthening IP frameworks for AI and other emerging tech. And it also encourages commercialization. So the proposed the AI Governance Act, which is part of the policy, also lists the future legislative priorities, and IP falls under there. Governance of IP falls under there. Also lists trading data and text and data mining under the future legislative priorities. So here the gap that I'm seeing is that the provisions are recognizing the issue. The policy defers the main question of where the ownership will actually be to the future legislation. And then it also lists KIPI as a regulatory body that would help with that. But then when we're talking about IP and AI, there's KIPI, which has industrial property governance of that of industrial property rights. We also have copyright, which is under the Kenya Copyright Board. Now I mentioned that there was a Kenya IP bill which came back into conversation after the first one in 2020. And the key thing with this bill is that it seeks to merge KIPI, KEKOBO, and the Anti-Counterfeit Authority into one office. So we'd have an IP authority. If that is the case, then the policy, that gap is widened because which body are we actually talking about right now? It also indicates that it does not indicate who should own an AI-assisted invention or creative work. I talked about the bill. So in the bill, it has the IP bill. It has kind of brought in AI-assisted inventions into the industrial property would-be act. So the bill, because it talks about a possibly patentable invention which has an AI-assisted, there's AI assistance in it. AI-generated inventions would not get a patent for that. So there's that gap in seeing there's current reform that's happening in the IP landscape. Then we have the AI policy coming in, but there's no connection between the two. So the question still remains, what is the direction towards AI-generated output? And I would have hoped that the policy would have talked about that. So the second point I noted was on the licensing and training data. So under the policy statement 3.6.2, and specifically number 3, the government commits to clarify the licensing conditions under which open government datasets may be used in AI model training and require readiness assessments prior to publication of the open data sets. So this data ecosystem management pillar also establishes governance mechanisms around the data catalog, governance, interoperability, and the like. But the gap here that I am seeing is that the policy does not really address the corporate issues around the issues surrounding AI training data. So the section 4.5.3.4, which talks about the core issues that will be in the future act, identify text and data mining, copyrighted works and training data as matters for future legislation. So it doesn't really indicate whether Kenya intends to introduce the data mining exception. However, in the Copyright and Related Rights Bill, which has already undergone public participation, it provides for text and data analysis for non-commercial research. So I feel like the gap is still there. On one side, we have a bill that is talking about it has provided some form of direction, which the AI policy possibly could have adopted or improved on it. So again, the AI policy will leave the question open as to if you're using copyrighted works to train your AI, is that going to be lawful? What is the direction? What are the conditions that would be there? In terms of compensation for where data has been scraped, what happens? Who is liable for that? Is there an opt-out right for the right owners when their work is being used or potentially going to be mined for research, for innovation? What is the opt-out option? So those are some of the guidelines I would have hoped that the policy would actually provide, and as well be in line with whatever is already happening in terms of reform around the IP ecosystem. Then we move on to commercialization. So this one is largely developed under statements 3.1 to 3.1.1 to 3.1.3, and it proposes the data repository that Florence talked about, an AI innovation fund. It even gives incentives such as Made in Kenya AI certificate programs under the annexes, and then also gives KIPI again as the implementing institution and provides a budget of 4 billion over 5 years. So this is well developed and it's good, but it's not connected to the unresolved ownership question. So if you're talking about commercialization and there's a gap between who actually owns it, then who's going to commercialize it? So that uncertainty is still very wide. And it talks about the National IP Commercialization Support Program. So if we establish that body, yet there's still a gaping question as to who is owning AI-assisted, AI-generated works. I don't understand how that program would actually, it would be better if we first fix, or rather get some guidelines on ownership and then now come up with an implementing body. Then lastly is the protection of local traditional and cultural expressions, which falls under policy statement 3.9.4. And I think Florence mentioned a lot of what it provides for, a national African languages and voice AI program, governance rules based on consent, attribution, benefit sharing, and community participation. So the policy states that language and cultural data initiatives should not extract value from communities without fair recognition, safeguards, and equitable benefit sharing. And this is also reinforced in the proposed AI Governance Act in the list of future issues. So here the gap would be that they are more principle-based rather than implementation-focused. So the policy refers to consent, attribution, and equitable benefit sharing, but doesn't really explain who provides the consent, what benefit sharing arrangements would be in operation, what mechanisms will interact with Kenya's existing legal framework. So interestingly, it doesn't refer to the Protection of Traditional Knowledge and Cultural Expressions Act, which governs traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. So that gap is also there. When I look at all the issues that I've mentioned, the four, it shows that the policy really still leaves the legal question of ownership to the future legislation. What a recommendation that I would probably propose would be a clearer policy direction of ownership. So this would help to answer the question about creating certainty for the innovator And then secondly would be to align with the existing IP laws. So currently the copyright laws that we have, the Industrial Property Act that we have, and the Protection for Traditional Knowledge and Cultural Expressions, but also with the reforms that are ongoing, which seek to modernize our IP legal framework. And I believe that the policy is also seeking to do the same. So just some form of synergy between all these different kinds of reforms. Then just to note that there's an alignment between the IP policy that is just completed its public participation as well as this AI policy. The main gap for me that I see is that they don't really speak to each other, so they don't provide certainty for the AI development and ownership for inventors. The AI policy refers broadly to strengthening the IP frameworks, but does not really recognize the ongoing IP reform as I mentioned. In the list of laws which need to be reformed, I didn't quite clearly see the Copyright Act or the Industrial Property Act or the Protection of Traditional Knowledge that I mentioned. So it seems like different efforts are being made towards a similar goal. It would be best if these two are actually speaking to each other, and the current reforms that we're having actually are taken into consideration, so that is a coordinated approach for greater certainty for the innovators, for the creators, and to build the Kenya innovation AI ecosystem, which includes the AI landscape. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chebet, for those particular insights. So we are still seeing that there are still apparent gaps that the policy said it was intending to solve, as policy issues being the fragmentation of laws, but expanding the scope of the fragmentation of laws to not only look at it within what we consider generally the AI ecosystem in terms of data protection laws, cybersecurity laws, but expanding the scope of what the fragmented laws ideally could look at. So ensuring that those also sort of speak to each other, in as much as they're laws that are being developed in different disciplines, but in parallel to each other. So ensuring that they're speaking to each other because they also interact with each other in one way or the other. Thank you so much, Chebet. So we'll then move to Dr. Betsy Mureithi to give us a bit of the scope or the feeling of research innovation, as well as the wider tech ecosystem, and what this particular policy then now means for that particular sector. Betsy, welcome.
All right, thank you, Florence. I think the policy did a good job in terms of centralizing research, innovation, and commercialization ecosystem, looking at what are the enabling factors, and trying to put in place an enabling environment for what they are calling indigenous AI development, while having strong responsibilities around safety, accountability, and compliance. So from research innovation and the wider ecosystem around technology, it offers 6 main things. The first one being, I guess, some clarification on the standards from within the AI development and deployment life cycle. So at the data level, they've proposed standards around dataset documentation, quality, custodianship, update cycles, referencing the Data Protection Act, but adding a bit more around data sharing, things that haven't been touched on. That's section 3.5 looks at, or 3.7 looks at national testing and safety. So what are the bare minimums around AI safety, interoperability? And then looking at, they also propose a risk-based regulatory framework, which I think the AI bill does mention. So this risk-based regulatory framework, so it proposes developing of one. So I don't know if it will be developed before the bill is put in is made an act, or before, I don't know. I will wait and see how that happens. There are also standards around cloud data centers hosting and infrastructure resilience, especially around green, what they're calling green intelligence, given the impact of data centers on the environment. And so together, the provisions provide a bit of certainty for developers building products in terms of understanding what would be regulated, what standards would need to be established and maintained. And so there's the positive whereby common standards can reduce repeated compliance work, There's standards around procurement requirements for locally developed AI within government, and then overall help demonstrate that our technology meets a certain quality standard in regional and international markets. However, it doesn't say how this compliance approach will happen. Will it happen at once? And we know the way the Kenyan way is, you have standards, then it's a wholesale. There's no phased approach. Preferably a risk-based approach, so that if you're considered low risk, these are the standards you need to comply. If you're medium, these are the standards you need to comply. Is the same documentation needed for audit or certification requirements, or are we doing the usual, you need a certificate for every institution in the government, whether it's an IP, you go to the data protection officer, you go to the AI officer, you go to the county department to get certification or compliance. So that is not clear in terms of how the requirements would apply, and can tend to be very expensive, especially for early stage innovators, if you have to hit several certification bodies at once. And so while they're developing the standards, they should be standards that help local innovators compete, should be enabling quality, enabling framework, rather than administrative barriers for market entry. Another good thing that is in the policies around regulatory sandboxes and responsible experimentation. So I guess as we try to figure out what risk-based is, we have these regulatory sandboxes. And so sections 3.1.3 and 3.5.3 propose regulatory sandboxes for control testing environments. And we've seen how sandboxes work well in terms of testing before you identify appropriate standards. And I think the safety institution, for example, is a good idea, whereby you look at what are the harms we expect, how do we control for that, and how do we establish standards or compliance for that. For which sectors are there key harm might affect, like agriculture, health, education, finance. So these are the important pathways for testing innovative products where existing regulations are unclear. The policy should be a bit more in terms of what is the defined outcome. Is it approval? Is it conditional approval? Is it procurement eligibility? Is it a certification to be in the market? They should also bridge that research innovation to market entry. And so it won't become like a waiting room for innovations where innovations go to die. So after the sandbox, what next? Does the sandbox also help to get users if you don't have users? Does it help you get into the market? For example, if it's a government application, is it a direct link to be absorbed? We've seen sandboxes like Britam have this innovation sandbox whereby they allow people to come develop different products, and then those get absorbed. The successful ones get absorbed into the organization. So is it a similar thing? That's not clear. The other sector is around data and access, I think, to both public and non-public data. And so 3.6 provides important opportunities around registration of high-value data sets, but not just government or public data sets, but also non-public data sets that are for specified public interest. They don't define what a public interest is and what non-public, is it private? So non-public data for public interest applications. But that's interesting because we've seen, how Safaricom holds a lot of data, but none of it is opened in an anonymized way for research or further development outside Safaricom. Not to put Safaricom in blast, just the example that came into my head. And so why this matters is, we spend a lot of time trying to find data set as researchers and developers, which institution holds it, how can we access it? We're working on a project right now that requires data sharing agreements across multiple organizations, and those ones are taking forever, that then stifles development and innovation. And so I mean, it's a good way to develop the common catalogs, the metadata standards, what control, like building back to the regulatory sandbox. I think there was mention around federated data sharing agreements. But the key caveat is around the National Data Library. I don't think there's another need for another repository. There are several. So, for example, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics has their open data platforms. I think it was all the rage when we had the open data initiatives, but hardly gets updated now. So rather than building another monolith that will ride the wave of the hype of AI, and then once the hype has died, will be relegated to the archives. I think we need to think about mechanisms for maintenance and incentivizing data sharing. Rather than developing another repository. So like KNBS has a repository. If you want agricultural data, you go to KALRO. They have a very good repository on all their research and whatever content they produce. And so how do we expose these repositories and have them shared, right? And so, the National Data Library could be, rather than a repository, but maybe a catalog that then can measure how many users are accessing, what is documented, how much data is actually being used tied to specific outcomes, so that you can measure that value. Another aspect is around compute and digital infrastructure. I think compute has been a major cog, especially in AI development. And so Section 3.8 does recognize compute as a strategic infrastructure and specific emphasis on green intelligence. So while we are building our compute, taking note of doing it in a responsible way around the environment in terms of not just energy, but also water and noise pollution and everything that comes with establishing data centers. Compute costs is one of the hugest barriers, especially for early stage companies and researchers, especially if you're doing experimentation work that you don't have funding for. It becomes a very key barrier. And so shared infrastructure could make possible. They don't address existing shared infrastructure. So for example, KNET has been trying to develop shared infrastructures for universities. So if you're a Kenyan university and you're a KNET member, you do have access to shared compute. Unfortunately, a lot of that compute is routed to South Africa because that's where the data centers are. But yeah, so that can be one approach rather than, developing the data center. I think it's Ambassador Philip Thigo always talks about, rather than, if you can't do it, there's another country that can do it. For example, South Africa already has the data center. So how do we collaborate with them to access their infrastructure? And so you have this sovereignty within the Africa as a community, rather than doing individual developments, which can, I think establishing data centers can go beyond our GDP. So how do we leverage the network within Africa to strengthen this and use established ecosystems that are trying to address this currently? And then in terms of commercialization and market access, I think there are several mechanisms that have been proposed around moving innovations to market. So they've mentioned incubation and acceleration programs. They've mentioned an innovation fund, competitive grants, equity and milestone financing, collaboration with government and industry. So look at procurement strategies for government in terms of absorbing local AI developed, and then there's protection and commercialization support. So I think those are key. Incubation and acceleration programs and AI hubs, I think no need to establish new ones. They're already existing. So it's just identifying which ones to leverage and build up rather than starting from scratch. There are quite a number of county level incubation and acceleration hubs and innovation hubs that can be supported to drive this commercialization and market angle. And then there's also the public procurement for homegrown technologies. I think that's one of the key barriers whereby big tech is always leveraging government relations to push their products. So how do we reverse this, whereby you have homegrown technologies that meet the established standards being taken up by government? So the policy still needs a connected pathway from research to market. How do I move from research to prototype to validation, sandbox testing, then certification, and then pilot procurement, and then regional scaling, right? It needs to define what is homegrown, what is locally developed. So if it's Google Africa develops a product for Kenya, is that locally developed, right? Because it's Google Africa and they have presence in Kenya and they develop stuff for Africa and Kenya. So what is locally developed? Again, no need to build incubation hubs or acceleration programs, just enable the existing ones. And I think by now most universities have incubation hubs. There are a lot of locally county level incubation hubs that can be tapped into. I think the last thing is around IP and protection of innovation. I think Chebet has done a huge deep dive, and I can't do it as good as her because I'm not an IP expert. But I think the legal provisions on AI generated outputs is quite critical in terms of how do you protect AI generated outputs, because the underlying mechanisms were someone else's IP, and then now the output might be, anyway, it's complicated. So it'll be interesting how they can sort of unpack that a bit more. Looking at also how do public procurement contracts protect developers' reusable background. So if I do public procurement for a certain technology, can I resell it, or is it locked within the government, right? We've seen, how the US government is with their technologies, right? So once they have that override or overview in terms of I can't let some of my key high priority AI models out to other jurisdictions and stuff like that. So would that be limiting as well, if you're thinking about public procurement contracts and innovation? And then lastly is just the AI risk-based regulatory environment. So differentiating obligations according to the risk presented by the AI system. So it will be interesting to see how they come up with this and not, replicate the EU Act. So what is risk-based for Kenya? Or if you're looking at exporting some of these technologies to the region, so what is risk? A high risk, low risk, medium risk within the region. So I think it will be interesting to see how that regulation would look like and what the I guess the burden of compliance would look like as well. So back to you, Florence.
Thank you so much, Betsy. I will move right next to Joshua because I'm seeing we're running a bit out of time. So Joshua, over to you to speak to the data governance, general data governance ecosystem as it correlates to the AI governance ecosystem as well, and what this policy sort of means for how data governance looks like currently.
All right. So I look at it from the point of especially the legal foundation. The policy tries as much as possible to align with especially data governance aspects. And one key area is especially the legal aspects. We find the core legal instruments that are mentioned in the policy include the Constitution of Kenya, which anchors especially data governance in the aspect of the right of privacy. The Constitution also covers equality and non-discrimination, access to information, and also consumer rights. And also the Data Protection Act, which is key legislation that governs personal data processing, governs data subject rights, and also creates obligations for both data controllers and processors. Other statutes that are the policy has tried to, as much as possible to introduce that are not commonly seen in other instruments. We find the Kenya Information and Communications Act, Computer Misuse and Cyber Crimes, and also the Standards Act, which, according to the policy, provides an important basis for interoperability, quality assurance, and also safety. And it also mentions the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act. But these legislations are mainly data governance concentrated. So when they were developed, they were not really focused on AI, which is something that's important to note. But it's good that the policy mentions these legislations. Another thing is what has been noted severally about institutional fragmentation. So the policy notes that responsibility for especially data governance is currently spread across the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner, the ODPC. We also have the Communications Authority and the ICT Authority. The Kenya, it also mentions the Kenya Bureau of Standards and sector regulators. And the issue here is there's a risk of overlapping mandates and regulatory ambiguity, weak coordination, undeveloped standards, and also inconsistent implementation across sectors, which has been observed severally, and which is a key thing to note. Apart from that, it's important to see how the policy complements the data protection and governance aspect. So this can be looked at from three levels. One, I would say, is the principled alignment. So several of the policies guiding principles restate and also extend data protection and governance values, especially human rights-based approach. We also have transparency and accountability, sovereignty and strategic autonomy, interoperability, and also open standards. The second one is a dedicated data governance layer. So it creates a thematic pillar, especially the data ecosystem management, which addresses the data set quality, access and sharing, high-value data sets, a national data library, and also trusted data flows. And also there are aspects of language and cultural data that are also mentioned in the policy. The third one is the legal and institutional bridging. So one thing about the policy is it specifies a data governance amendment bill to be developed by the Attorney General, ODPC, and ministry responsible for ICT. Especially, and the key aspect of this is to expand the legal provisions governing AI-ready data ecosystems. So that's a unique aspect I noted, especially when it comes to data governance. When it comes to key thematic issues, especially like access, the policy, it treats data access as something that needs its own lawful structured framework consistent with data protection compliance. So it commits to a number of aspects, especially first one being lawful data sharing protocols. So the government commits to developing standardized, interoperable data sharing and use protocols across sectors. And next one is the controlled access to non-public data sets. In this case, the government commits to developing guidelines governing the controlled sharing of non-public data sets for public interest applications in AI and other emerging tech. We also have high-value data sets and sectoral access. So some of these components are found in the annex and also in the main body of the policy. So under high-value data sets and sectoral access, a national register of high-value AI-relevant data sets is proposed that prioritizes especially agriculture, health, financial inclusion, and education, with structured controlled access mechanisms for approved research and innovation uses. And finally, under access, the government establishes clear, lawful, and accountable frameworks that will govern how data is accessed, shared, and procured across all sectors, and to develop guidelines for controlled access environments, including data sandboxes, which are relevant, trusted research environments, and federated access mechanisms. So, brought together with the Data Protection Act, this basically supplements the provisions that are already there, and add a structured access layer on top of the existing lawful basis requirements that we have in the Data Protection Act. Another thing is data quality. So data quality, the policy defines data quality as the extent to which data is accurate, complete, timely, relevant, consistent, and fit for purpose, which is an important aspect also when it comes to personal data protection. there's the issue of data quality, especially when it comes to data accuracy. And here the police commits to provenance requirements so that data sets used in AI systems have traceable origin records directly relevant to accountability for AI-driven organizations. We also have data quality assurance protocols and audits to check the data sets before they are used in AI systems, which is important. Also, there's a specific commitment to develop high quality, unbiased, locally relevant data sets that reflect Kenya's linguistic diversity and undeserved population, reducing especially reliance on foreign data sets. So you'll find some of these aspects, they may not be directly mentioned in the Data Protection Act, but the policy tries to address them and supplement the provisions we already have. When it comes to interoperability, so it appears as a cross-cutting principle and also an operational requirement. So the guiding principle, especially interoperability and open standards, it commits public sector AI systems to interoperable architectures and open and proprietary interfaces subject to legitimate security and privacy consideration, which this explicitly link interoperability to data portability and avoidance of vendor lock-in, which is covered well in the annex part. We also have data sharing protocols, which are required to be interoperable within certain indicators tracked as KPIs. Also, this analysis also flags that national county system integration remains inconsistent, which is a gap that the policy's coordination framework is designed to help and address the situation over time. So apart from that, now I'll address I'll go straight to security. So security is an important aspect in the data governance field, which the AI policy tries to cover this comprehensively. So it's addressed as a data-specific concern and as part of the broader ethics, safety, security, and inclusion pillar. So key aspects that I noted are especially it emphasizes the national cybersecurity frameworks to be updated, especially to address AI-specific threats, such as adversarial attacks, data poisoning, synthetic media misuse, and also risks to critical infrastructure, which you don't find them directly addressed in the cybercrimes legislation. And also, it emphasizes a dedicated AI incident response protocol, including training institutional focal people, a compliant escalation workflow, victim notification processes, and a national AI incident database. And finally, when it comes to the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act, it identifies it as leading extension, especially to cover AI-enabled cyber attacks and autonomous system misuse. So the act itself might mention crimes in general, but it doesn't go to the specificities that are required to be addressed, especially when dealing with AI-powered cyber attacks, which the police tries to address. When it comes to responsible data use, this is especially, it's contained to the policy's ethics provisions and its treatment of especially vulnerable groups and language and also cultural data. So according to the principle on human rights-based approach, it commits to strong data protection measures for children alongside age-appropriate system design and safeguards against manipulative practices. So you find that children, at least it tries to address children and vulnerable groups in this in the policy. We also have, it also requires issues of transparency, accountability, and explainability guidelines, disclosure templates, and a public or institutional register for high-risk AI systems, which gives a special practical effect to the Data Protection Acts of fairness and accountability in the AI-specific context. And it also creates protection frameworks for vulnerable, marginalized groups and age-appropriate safeguards for child-facing AI systems, which will be led by the State Department for Child Services with the support of the ODPC. Another key aspect is the African Languages and Cultural Data Program, which sets consent and benefit sharing rules for community held data used in AI training, extending especially the responsible data use beyond individual personal data to collective and cultural data, which current legislations don't really address in the specificities. And also there's an AI assurance body proposed to audit and certify AI systems, providing an accountability mechanisms that complements especially the ODPC's compliance and enforcement role rather than duplicating it. So yeah, in short, so that's what I get from the policy. It tries as much as it can to complement whatever you have in the data governance sphere. Yeah, I think that's from my end.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I'm seeing we are way past time, so we'll just head into some of the concluding parameters and some of the questions and comments that have been raised by the participants online. But thank you so much to Chebet, Dr. Betsy, and Joshua for the insights they have given. We are seeing that in as much as the policy is quite robust, it does have strengths and key elements in which it tries to look at the regulation of artificial intelligence within the country, but it also still has quite a number of, I would say, gaps that still exist within the commitments that it's making in terms of the thematic areas that it has identified across the different thematic areas, which we have seen established under discussion, which have come out as Chebet has discussed elements of intellectual property, as Betsy has also looked at research, innovation, and the ecosystem, and as well as Joshua has looked at the data governance sort of elements of it. We are also noticing the fact that in as much as we have all these parameters, we are seeing we already have foundational existing I would say foundational existing systems or institutionalized mechanisms that are already there all the way down to sort of county level. So looking at ways in which we can build on those as opposed to developing things from scratch, well, we already have the foundational base through which some of the elements that are being described or suggested within the policy can sort of already be anchored, so that they are more or less scaled within the ecosystem as opposed to developing from scratch, in as much as we already have the infrastructure for those sort of available. So I will go directly into some of the questions that have been raised. We are having one question being raised with respect to the data governance policy, in noting that the draft of it, this policy in and of itself proposes a data governance act, and the same is also was also proposed within the draft data governance policy as well. So just a question, we are seeing them being developed, being spoken about into two different policies. So would we then say that these two policies are sort of aligned, or it's also showing up as a gap in and of itself as well? I would also note that it is true that this policy establishes, or rather suggests the establishment of an act of a specific data governance one, whereas the draft data governance policy framework as well already had that provision. So we are sort of seeing an area where the two also, in as much as they were being developed in parallel, may not have necessarily been sort of speaking to each other, because ideally one would expect that such an act would be raised within that particular policy framework, because it stands under that umbrella for developing a data governance framework for the nation. So I think that is one of the other parts that still remains as a sort of seen gap in how very likely they are sort of not aligned in as much as they were being developed in parallel. Yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. We get a bit of parting shots from our panelists as we conclude. So we'll start with Chebet, roll down to Dr. Betsy, and then conclude with Joshua. So parting shots with respect to the discussions we've had and the AI policy generally.
Thank you, Florence, and thank you for organizing this very important conversation. I did note that I think one person had talked about open data. What if the data is open source? Does this law hold? So I'll make reference to the definitions in the policy. They talk about, they define what open data is as data that is made available for access, use, reuse, and sharing, with minimal restrictions, subject to lawful and necessary safeguards. Then in when I was talking about the licensing, I think I mentioned about where it's open government data and it's used for training, which has to still go through some form of assessment. So firstly is to say, when you talk about open data, it could be that you have access to this data, but you don't have the permission to use it to train and come up with your own other outputs from it. So you have to seek permission from that. So it's important to note to what extent you are lawfully allowed to use this open data. Even if you think about the Creative Commons licenses, there are somewhat of parameters in which you can use that data for commercial use, not commercial, share alike, etc. There's the Moodle license, which also gives you the parameters of how you can use open data sets. So it holds, but then it still gives us some form of a threshold as to what extent you can actually use or not use it, based on what laws would be applicable there. My parting shot is that I hope, pray, wish that the different ministries that are coming up with this laws on AI and IP come together, sit together, and have a unified direction, because I find that the IP policy mentions AI and emerging tech. The AI policy mentions IP, but none of them are actually providing direction to solve the issues that innovators are actually having. Thank you.
Over to Betsy.
Yeah, no, I'd like to thank the participants, quite a number of you, for attending. I guess my parting shot is, Kenya is normally not short of very good policies. I think our issue is around implementation. So I'd be quite keen to see what the implementation for this would look like. I think they do provide a phased implementation approach. There's a lot of foundational stuff that needs to be put in place first before we see the goal. So it's just to see in terms of implementation, the promises that have been put in place, how they're going to be implemented. Very keen on the AI Safety Institute, because we are also doing some benchmarking stuff at ILAB. Back to you, Florence.
Thank you, Betsy. Over to Joshua.
For me, I'll say the policy looks like a very forward-looking document, which is good. What I would like to see is more of, I would echo what Betsy has said, more of implementation, especially when it comes to aspects of interoperability. We find like many policies have mentioned this over and over again, but don't see much happening on the ground. So I think, I hope this will just not remain as a document, but there will be implementation, serious implementation of the policy itself. Thank you.
Thank you all so much to the panelists. And this is goodbye for real now. Thank you all so much for staying up until right now. We look forward to having further conversations as we see the AI governance landscape within the country evolve. So a lovely week and a lovely day to you all. Asante ni sana.